talking about sexuality is not a very normal thing. It's still taboo.
In Turkish society, a woman disgraces her family if she has sex before marriage. For men, it's allowed and sometimes even encouraged. Men between the ages of 18 and 25, along with married men in their middle ages, make up a significant portion of the clientele. And sex tourism is a booming business for TRNC for two reasons. First, it's cheap. The women charge about $150 to $300 for sex. The second reason, the lack of law enforcement.
They pay huge amounts of taxes, and this shows that demand is very huge.
Nightclubs and pubs provide about $4.7 million to the economy of northern Cyprus. That's a large chunk for a population just under 295,000. Prostitution in casinos, hotels, coffee houses, and brothels also pump lots of money into the economy, but it's unclear how much. 2/3 of this money come from tourists, and sex workers typically do not see much of the earnings. They make approximately $170 a month, but they often owe money to their employer for travel expenses and housing. And that's only if they come into the country legally. Many of them do not. We really do not know how many sex trafficking victims are in TRNC because authorities do not keep accurate data. Sex trafficking is also a major issue for the Republic of Cyprus. But unlike TRNC, the south of the island has stepped up efforts to combat the problem. Still, according to the U.S. State Department, the Republic of Cyprus has a ways to go. The country landed on the Tier 2 list in 2013. That's better than 2012, when it was on the Tier 2 watch list. But the U.S. State Department says Cyprus does not fully adhere to the minimum standards to fight human trafficking. But it's making substantial progress to bring itself up to that level. Between 2011 and 2012, the government substantially increased its number of human trafficking investigations, prosecutions, and convictions. Authorities investigated 47 new cases of suspected trafficking in 2012. The year before, the country only investigated 29. Even though this is a great first step, conviction rates for traffickers lag behind other countries. As of 2013, Cyprus has yet to convict someone for human trafficking under its 2007 law, which comes with a 15-year prison sentence. Traffickers are often convicted of lesser crimes and sometimes only had to pay fines without serving any jail time. The problem not only lies with convictions, but stems from how officials treat victims.
They will be frightened to tell the truth because they are afraid something will happen to their families. And unless we start with their fears, it might not be that successful to get enough evidence from her.
Alina Baducci is from Moldova and works to help trafficking victims from her country. She says the police and the courts often ignore the significant trauma victims have endured.
We had a case of a girl who she was trafficked and she was told that she will be resold to someone else. And when she heard it, everything was happening in a hotel. She just opened the curtain, opened the window, and it was 5th floor, and she just jumped out of the window. She didn't remember anything besides the fact that she jumped from the window. That's all. She didn't remember what happened before or what has happened after. And it took her like 3 to 4 months to start to remembering.
Often victims do not seek help because they do not trust authorities. If they do reach for a way out, they typically are not provided adequate representation in Cyprus.
And seeing that he has a lawyer and you don't, makes you realize that you might not be that safe or that much protected.
Finding the proper care, housing, and employment also continues to be a problem for victims. Even though services exist in Cyprus, ministries and the government do not coordinate properly. Plus, there's not enough funding to ensure that these men and women are safe. And often victims fear being deported back to their native countries because they'll be labeled as a prostitute.
She will feel rejected by her family, by the community. People will say like, everyone knows what happened to you. You were probably a prostitute abroad.
When they return home with no money, chances are they'll be trafficked again.
The environment she's coming back to is even worse than the one she left from. She was missing. She probably had no chance to call, and she's coming without money. If she was already having debts before she left the country, now the debts are even bigger.
Tight-knit Cypriot communities are not always compassionate towards sex trafficking victims. That's because they have deep-rooted stereotypes about sex and minorities. Many Cypriots consider human sex trafficking a horrendous crime, but like many European countries, prostitution is often culturally accepted. But when do you draw the line? When does prostitution become sex trafficking? This stereotypical image of a little girl being tied up and locked in a room is not your typical trafficking victim. Sex workers are typically out in the open, appearing as if they're free to make their own decisions, and this makes it difficult for governments to keep up with the crime.
And because trafficking and traffickers are always one step ahead of us, it's quite hard for us to foresee what will happen next.
Often people who pay for sex are unaware that these men and women are not consenting adults. They also do not realize how the sex trade is destroying lives. But Natalie Cameron has seen the ramifications firsthand.
The hurt and the pain they put in those girls' hearts, I would never know because I've never been through it, but I've seen firsthand girls that have been trafficked. And I know how broken they are. I know how ashamed they are. They are breaking their spirits, their lives, their families, their future. And I want to ask them if it was your wife, if it was your daughter, because I know most of them have families. Would you want them to go through the same thing as you put the other girls?
Sex trafficking is not just happening somewhere else in the world. It also occurs in America, in places where you least expect.
People don't really understand what human trafficking is.
Assistant Special Agent Margie Quinn with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation is in charge of the Bureau's efforts to fight human trafficking within the state. She says the crime is a relatively new phenomenon.
In the United States, people generally think that this is a foreign national problem, that this is something that happens overseas. They think it involves transportation or movement. They think it has to occur in urban areas, and we find that none of those things are the case.
Out of the 21 counties that reported the highest number of kids being trafficked, 17 were from rural areas, says the TBI.
You don't have to get a foreign national child or young girl or young boy to traffic. You can get an American girl, a Tennessee girl, a Tennessee boy to traffic. And there are thousands and thousands of them all across this state that go missing or are reported missing every year in our state. And they are ripe for victimization.
Sheila Simpkins McLean was one of them. She was only 14 when she was trafficked for the first time. The average age of a sex trafficking victim is 13, according to the TBI.
At an early age, I was conditioned to think that it was okay for men to touch me, and I thought it was okay for me to give oral sex. It's because that's stuff that was taught to me as a child. And so really, whenever I ran away from home and met the pimp, it seemed almost better because he perpetrated like he loved me.
And the cycle of abuse typically starts at home.
Many of these women are first abused by their mothers, and that, I think, would be very surprising to people. I think people typically think, oh, well, they're probably abused by their fathers or an older brother or a cousin. No, many of these women are abused at their mother's hands first.